Physiology of Respiration. BCC. Physiology of Respiration. Dr. K. Gahere. Physiology of Respiration. Respiration definition. Respiration is the process in living organisms involving intake of oxygen and release of CO2 for production of energy from oxidation of complex organic molecules. Respiratory organs. Organs that provide suitable surface for exchange of O2 and CO2 in between environment and body of animal are called respiratory organs. Respiration takes place by different organs in various animals. In unicellular organisms and many other non-chordates, respiration takes place through their general body surface. Other animals have skin, gills, book lungs, trachea, buccal cavity, and lungs as their respiratory organs. For higher vertebrates including human, lungs are the only respiratory organs, and those are the most suitable respiratory organs for terrestrial mode of life. Here we will discuss physiology of respiration, particularly with reference to human. Two processes of respiration. Respiration involves two separate but interrelated processes, viz. External respiration and internal respiration. Internal respiration or cellular respiration involves the metabolic processes carried out for production of energy-rich molecule ATP by using O2. These processes mainly include Krebs cycle, electron transfer, and oxidative phosphorylation in mitochondria. During these processes, CO2 is released. External respiration. The term external respiration involves the entire sequence of events involving exchange of respiratory gases between environment and the cells of the body. It involves 4 different steps. 1. Breathing. Air is alternately moved in and out of the lungs so that the respiratory gases exchanged between atmosphere and air sacs, alveoli, of lungs. It is also called ventilation. Rate of breathing in controlled and changed according to the need of body. It involves inhalation and exhalation. 2. Exchange of respiratory gases between air in alveoli and pulmonary capillaries by diffusion. 3. Respiratory gases are transported by blood between lungs and the tissue. 4. Exchange of respiratory gases between blood and tissue by diffusion across the systemic capillaries. Respiratory system. Respiratory system involves 1. Respiratory airways. 2. Lungs, and 3. Structure of thorax. 1. Respiratory airways. Respiratory airways are tubes that carry air from atmosphere to the respiratory surface, i.e. alveoli. It begins with nasal passage and includes pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. Nasal passage: esophagus, nose, larynx, trachea, bronchus. Alveolar space for heart, left lung, body wall, pleura, right lung, diaphragm. Human respiratory system. 1. BCC. Physiology of respiration. Dr. K. Gahere. Nasal passage. It is the entry point of respiratory passage. The anterior nares or nostrils are the openings of this cavity. 2. It is a large irregular cavity divided into 2 equal passages by a septum. Posterior part of septum is bony while anteriorly it is cartilaginous. 3. Its lining is of vascular ciliated columnar epithelium among which mucus-secreting goblet cells are present. IV. The air is warmed, filtered, cleaned and humidified while traveling through this passage. B. Pharynx. Nasal passage leads behind to pharynx or throat. It is wider than nasal passage. 2. It is a common passage for respiratory and digestive system. At its base 2 lead, from it, trachea and esophagus. 3. Opening of trachea is glottis and opening of esophagus is gullet. IV. Glottis remains always open, except at the time of swallowing. During swallowing it is closed by epiglottis. It prevents entry of food particles into windpipe. C. Larynx. I. Larynx or voice box is present at the enterotrachea. 2 vocal cords made up of elastic tissue lie across its opening. 2. The vocal cords can be starched and positioned by laryngeal muscles. 3. As air passes through larynx, these vocal cords vibrate and sound is produced. D. Trachea. I. Larynx continues behind to trachea or windpipe. It extends down up to 5th thoracic vertebra. 2. It is 10 to 11 cm in length, run in median plane ventral to esophagus. 3. It is supported by incomplete, C-shaped, rings of cartilage. The rings are incomplete dorsally, near esophagus. It allows esophagus to dilate during passing the bolus. IV. Wall of trachea is made up of 3 layers. Outer layer is of fibrous elastic tissue, middle layer is of cartilage and bands of smooth muscles, and inner layer is of ciliated columnar epithelium with mucus-secreting goblet cells that stops any particle to enter further in respiratory tract.
Bronchi.
I. At the level of 5th thoracic vertebra, trachea divides into 2 branches called primary bronchi, one going to each lung. 2. Right bronchus is wider and shorter, about 2.5 cm in length. After entering to the right lung, it divides into 3 secondary bronchi supplying to each lobe. 3. Left bronchus is narrower and longer, about 5 cm long. It divides into 2 secondary bronchi on entering the left lung and supplies to 2 lobes of left lung. IV. Structure of bronchi is similar to that of trachea. They are supported by complete rings of cartilage. V. They are lined by ciliated columnar epithelium. F. Bronchioles and their subdivisions. I. Bronchi further progressively subdivide into smaller branches like terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts. 2. Cartilage and smooth muscles are absent in bronchioles. Their walls become gradually thinner. A. Respiratory airways. 2. BCC. I. Physiology of Respiration, Dr. K. Gehere. 3. The columnar epithelium of bronchi gradually converted to cuboidal epithelium. In alveolar duct it is squamous epithelium. G. Alveoli. I. Terminal alveolar ducts lead to tiny air sacs called alveoli. The respiratory gases exchange takes place in alveoli. 2. The wall of alveoli is made up of a single layer of squamous epithelium cells. 3. Alveolar wall has 3 types of cells: alveolar cells type I, alveolar cells type II, and alveolar macrophages. IV. Alveolar cells type I are the squamous epithelial cells across which gases exchange takes place. The alveolar cells type II are somewhat larger secretory cells. They secrete surfactant. It is a phospholipid fluid, spread on the surface of alveolar cells. The surfactant keeps alveoli moist. It reduces surface tension and prevents alveolar collapsing. It also helps in exchange of gases. 7. Minute pores are present in the walls between neighboring alveoli. These are called pores of Kohn. They allow the respiratory air to pass through them to adjacent alveoli if its duct is blocked. 8. Alveoli and alveolar ducts are surrounded by a dense network of pulmonary capillaries. The respiratory surface. Lungs are ideal structure as a respiratory organ. It provides an efficient surface for gases exchange by diffusion. 2 things are essential to increase the efficiency of diffusion. First is thing is shorter distance across which diffusion takes place, and second larger surface area for the diffusion. The alveoli serve as respiratory surface. Their walls are made up of very thin squamous epithelium. Immediate outside it there are pulmonary capillaries. The walls of them are also very thin, made up of single layer of endothelial cells. In between these 2 surfaces there is very little interstitial fluid. Thus barrier between alveolar air and pulmonary blood is very thin. It is only about 0.5 mm. This quality of respiratory surface enhances its efficiency for gases diffusion. Secondly, presence of numerous alveoli increases the surface area. There are about 300 million alveoli having diameter about 300 mm. Total surface of alveoli are covered by the capillaries. So almost 100% air is available for respiration. This counts about 75 square meter. Oh, this is a huge area available for gases exchange. Increases the efficiency of respiration. 3. Respiratory surface, alveolus and surrounding capillaries showing respiratory surface. BCC. I. 2. Lungs. A, B, C, D. Physiology of respiration. Dr. K. There are two lungs laying on either sides of heart in the thoracic cavity. The middle surface of lung is concave and has hilum, bronchus, pulmonary artery, pulmonary veins, bronchial artery, bronchial vein, lymph vessels, and parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves. The right lung is divided into 3 lobes. Left lung is smaller and divided into 2 lobes. Lungs are composed of bronchi and smaller branches, alveoli, connective tissue, blood and lymph vessels and nerves. 3. Structure of thorax. Structure of thorax includes pleura and pleural cavity, ribs, and intercostal muscles and diaphragm. A pleura and pleural cavity. A double-walled closed sac called pleural sac surrounds and separate each lung from thoracic wall and other structures. 2. The outer pleural membrane is called parietal pleura and inner membrane called visceral pleura. 3. Interior to pleural sac is pleural cavity filled with intrapleural fluid. It acts as a lubricant. B. Ribs and intercostal muscles. I. The muscles present between 2 successive ribs are intercostal muscles. There are 11 pairs of intercostals muscles between 12 pairs of ribs. 2. They are arranged in 2 layers, the external and internal intercostal muscles. 3. External intercostal muscles extend in downward and forward direction while internal intercostal muscles extend in downward and backward direction. Both are perpendicular to each other. 5. External intercostal muscles are from upper rib to lower rib while internal intercostal muscles are from lower rib to upper rib. V. When external intercostal muscles contract, the ribs are pulled upward towards first rib and because of the shape of the ribs they pulled outward. VI. When internal intercostal muscles contract, the ribs are pulled downward and inward. 7. They are innervated by intercostals nerve. See diaphragm. A diaphragm is a dome-shaped structure separating thoracic cavity from abdominal cavity. 2. It consists of a central tendon from which the muscle fibers radiate and attach to lower ribs, sternum and vertebral column. 3. When diaphragm is relaxed, the central tendon is at the level of 8 thoracic vertebra. When it contracts, muscle fibers shorten and central tendon is pulled downwards. 5. Diaphragm action causes 75% of change in the thoracic volume. V. It is innervated by phrenic nerve. Mechanism of breathing. Alternate movement of atmospheric air in and out of the lungs is called breathing or ventilation. It takes place with the help of respiratory system and thoracic cavity. Rate of breathing is regulated in such a way. 4. BCC. I. Physiology of respiration. Dr. K. That it can fulfill the oxygen demand of the body. It has 2 steps: 1. Inspiration and 2. Expiration. This is because of cyclic changes in intra-alveolar pressure. 1. Inspiration. A flow of atmospheric air into the lungs is called inspiration. It is also called to breath in or inhalation. B. Air flows from higher pressure region to lower pressure region. So for inspiration, intra-alveolar air pressure is made less than atmospheric pressure. C. For this, volume of thoracic cavity, and thereby volume of lungs, is increased. For this, following events takes place. I. Contraction of diaphragm results in pulling it down. This increases the anterior-posterior length of thoracic cavity. 2. Contraction of external intercostal muscles. This pulls the ribs towards the first rib and due to shapes of ribs they are pushed outward. This increases dorsoventral length of thoracic cavity. 70% of volume change of thoracic cavity takes place due to activity of diaphragm. 3. Thus volume of thoracic cavity is increased by these 2 sets of muscles. Thereby volume of lungs increases and alveolar air pressure drops from 760 mm of mercury to 759 mm of mercury. So air flows into the lungs. 2. Expiration. A flow of alveolar air from lungs to exterior is called expiration. It is also called as breath out or exhalation. Before this, alveolar air pressure is made more than atmospheric pressure by decreasing the volume of thoracic cavity. C. For this, diaphragm and external intercostal muscles relaxed. Diaphragm becomes dome-shaped. Ribs are released down, so that rib cage moves downwards and inwards. D. The lungs relaxed due to their elastic nature. No extra energy is required for expiration. E. Thus volume of thoracic cavity and lungs decreases. The alveolar air pressure increases to 761 millimeters of mercury and air flows out of the lungs. 3. Forced breathing. 1. Sometimes to fulfill the extra demand of oxygen by the body, or in some pathological conditions, forced breathing is carried out. During forced breathing, along with diaphragm and external intercostal muscles, internal intercostal muscles, and some other muscles assist the breathing. 2. For forced inhalation, volume of thoracic cavity is more increased by the contraction of shoulder muscles and neck muscles. This causes pulling of first and second ribs upward. Rib cage moves more forward. Thus extra increased volume of thoracic cavity force more air into the lungs. 3. During forced exhalation, contraction of internal intercostal muscles causes pushing the ribs and sternum inwards. Some abdominal muscles also takes place, results in pushing of diaphragm. Thus volume of thoracic cavity reduced further, resulting in forced exhalation, lung volumes and capacities. O. Anatomical dead space. Though the complete respiratory airways from nasal passage to alveoli are filled by air, only the air in alveoli and alveolar ducts is used for the gases exchange. So the part of respiratory airway which is not useful for exchange of gases is called anatomical dead space. About 150 milliliter O tidal volume, TV. The amount of air passes in and out of the lungs during each cycle of quiet respiration is called tidal volume. It is about 500 milliliter O inspiratory reserve volume, IRV. The amount of extra air that can be inhaled into lungs during maximum inspiration is called inspiratory reserve volume. It is about 3000 milliliter, 5, BCC, I. Physiology of Respiration. Dr. K. Gehere. Inspiratory capacity, IC. The amount of air that can be inspired with maximum efforts is called inspiratory capacity. It includes tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. 3500 milliliter, expiratory reserve volume, IRV. The largest volume of air that can be expelled from lungs during maximum expiration is called expiratory reserve volume. 1000 milliliter, residual volume, RV. Respiratory airway never becomes completely empty. Some air always remains in it. The amount of air remains in the lungs after forced expiration is called residual volume. It cannot be directly measured. 1200 milliliter, functional residual capacity, FRC. The amount of air that remains in air passage and alveoli after quiet expiration is called functional residual capacity. 2200 milliliter. In every new cycle of breathing, fresh air is mixed with the residual air. The blood flow in the capillaries surrounding the alveoli is continuous, thus, alveoli are continuously engaged in gases exchange. Vital capacity, VC. The maximum volume of air which can be moved in and out of the lungs is called vital capacity. It includes tidal volume, IRV and ERV. 4500 milliliter, total lung volume. The maximum amount of air can present in lung is called total lung volume. It includes vital capacity and residual volume. 5700 milliliter, alveolar ventilation. The amount of air that moves in and out of alveoli per minute is called alveolar ventilation. Alveolar ventilation equals TV anatomical dead space, X respiratory rate, diffusion of gases exchange. 1. Partial pressure. In a mixture of gases, every gas exerts the pressure proportional to its volume in that mixture. It is called partial pressure of the gas. BEG atmospheric pressure 760 millimeters of mercury is exerted by air. In air amount of oxygen is 21%. So partial pressure of oxygen in atmosphere is 21% of 760, i.e. 160 millimeters of mercury, and partial pressure of CO2 is 0.03 millimeters of mercury. See, though we breathe atmospheric air, partial pressure of O2 at alveoli reduces to 100 millimeters of mercury. This is because as we inhale the air, it is moistened in the respiratory passage. Water vapor added to this air shares some part of pressure. Secondly, fresh air is mixed with the residual air in the anatomically dead space. T partial pressure of a gas is denoted as PO2 is partial pressure of oxygen and PCO2 is partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Gases can diffuse from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure passively, i.e. without consumption of energy. 2. Gases exchange at alveoli level. At alveoli, the gases exchange takes place across respiratory surface between alveolar air and pulmonary blood. B. Oxygen from alveolar air diffuses to pulmonary blood down the partial pressure gradient. Pulmonary blood is deoxygenated as oxygen is utilized by tissue for energy production. Circa PO2 at alveolar air is 100 millimeters of mercury, and that in pulmonary vein is 40 millimeters of mercury. So oxygen diffuses from alveolar air to pulmonary capillary. T. As blood passes through pulmonary capillary surrounding alveoli, more and more oxygen diffuses in it until PO2 is equalized with alveolar air, i.e. 100 millimeters of mercury. Carbon dioxide passively diffuses from pulmonary blood to alveolar air. Pulmonary blood brings CO2 generated in the tissue to the lungs. 6. BCC. I. Physiology of Respiration. Dr. K. Gaheri. F. So PCO2 in the pulmonary blood is 46 millimeters of mercury, as compared to alveolar air which has PCO2 40 millimeters of mercury. G. So CO2 diffuses down the partial pressure gradient until PCO2 in alveolar air becomes 46 millimeters of mercury. H. Thus pulmonary blood exciting from lung has PO2 100 millimeters of mercury and PCO2 40 millimeters of mercury. Gases exchange at tissue level. At tissue level, gases exchange takes place between systemic blood and tissue. B. Systemic blood carries oxygenated blood to tissue having PO2 100 millimeters of mercury, while tissue fluid has PO2 40 millimeters of mercury. C. So oxygen diffuses from blood to tissue passively down the partial pressure gradient. This diffusion is quintile PO2 after Suebers 100 mmHg. PCO2 in tissue is i.e. 46 millimeters of mercury as compared to systemic blood which is 40 millimeters of mercury. This is because CO2 is produced in tissue during metabolism. Thus CO2 diffuses from tissue to systemic blood until PCO2 in blood becomes 46 millimeters of mercury. F. The systemic blood leaving the tissue has PO2 40 millimeters of mercury and PCO2 46 millimeters of mercury. PO2 40 millimeters of mercury, PCO2 46 millimeters of mercury. Pulmonary artery, alveolus. Capillary, gases exchange at alveoli, PO2 100 millimeters of mercury, PCO2 40 millimeters of mercury. Pulmonary vein. PO2 100 millimeters of mercury, PCO2 40 millimeters of mercury. 3. PO2 40 millimeters of mercury, PCO2 46 millimeters of mercury. Systemic vein. PO2 100 millimeters of mercury, PCO2 40 millimeters of mercury. Gases exchange at tissue level. PO2 100 millimeters of mercury, PCO2 40 millimeters of mercury. Systemic artery. Tissue. Here one must note that deoxygenated blood has PO2 40 millimeters of mercury. This suggests that oxygen carried by the blood is not completely utilized by the tissue. Blood carried far more oxygen than required for the tissue. This excess oxygen acts as a reserve to provide extra oxygen whenever needed. Similarly, oxygenated blood has PCO2 40 millimeters of mercury. This CO2 is essential for maintaining blood pH. CO2 in blood combines with water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociated to bicarbonate ions in H+. Carbonic acid as proton donor and bicarbonate ion as proton acceptor forms a conjugate acid-base pair in a buffer system. This system helps in maintaining pH of